Oh, it's you.
Yeah, I'm James.
Angela.
Angela. Okay.
It's been almost 2 years since the reveal trailer for Silent Hill 2 Remake, when we finally found out that the franchise is coming back by reviving the best installment of its entire history, if we're talking about popularity. After this trailer, there has been an entire year of silence from Konami and the developers until January 2024, when we got the combat trailer, which was basically the most controversial thing in the horror gaming space for the last few months. Most people, including me, were not happy with how the game looked, how the combat animations felt, or how James's face was designed. It appeared like a huge step back compared to the reveal trailer, and it gave us the impression that Konami is not interested in delivering the best game possible, but rather the cheapest game possible. This controversy and rage from gamers pushed the developers themselves to come out and reveal that they were also not happy with the combat trailer, and that they're working on a much better version of the game. We made a few videos talking about this before, and we explained how criticism is actually playing a role in saving the remake, because it's forcing Konami and the developers to see their mistakes and fix them before the final release. And indeed, the tweaks were taking place in the last 4 months, and we saw a sign of that in the face update that secretly occurred to James, which proved that developers are really listening to the fans. However, that change alone was obviously not enough to make fans feel cheerful, and that's why the next trailers and gameplay footage were expected to be crucial and decisive in making us trust the developers again, or be excited for the game's release. And after a long silence, suddenly, out of nowhere, we got the new gameplay scenes we were looking for, and honestly, there's a lot to talk about here, because I was really surprised. First of all, let's keep the Angela trailer aside for now, and we'll talk about it later because I believe the long gameplay video that was released is much more relevant and gives us a much better idea of where the development is heading.
I got a letter. The name on the envelope said Mary. Mary died of that damn disease 3 years ago. Is she really?
In order to keep the analysis and criticism balanced, I'm going to start with the positive side. And I believe the first obvious upside we can see here is definitely the environment and how it looks. Anyone who thinks the environment doesn't look phenomenal clearly has no idea what they're talking about. When you talk about the perfect environment for a horror game, you usually think of a setting that looks oppressive, calm, and depressing. And that's exactly what we see here. But when we talk about the environment of Silent Hill 2 in particular, the fog always comes to mind first. The reason for this is that the fog represents the obscurity of the truth here, the distortion of reality, and creates a nightmarish place where James's deepest fears and desires manifest as grotesque entities. The fog here acts as a barrier between the normal world and the other world, a twisted dimension that reflects the character's psychological states. It also symbolizes the blurred lines between sanity and madness, reality and illusion. And this is why it's very important to make the fog look very effective and realistic in Silent Hill 2, in order to actually immerse us in the town. If we want to see how good the fog is in this remake, we need to focus on the entire environment at the same time, and see how the fog blends with everything else. If you look at the sky, you'll see that it's heavily cloudy in a genuine way, which is the perfect weather for fog. The wooden fences look old, scarred, and have stains of something that look like blood. However, when we think of fog in general, we think of it as a phenomenon that hides stuff from our sight, only to become gradually visible when we get closer. I really love how elements in the town here, like houses and trees, become clearer to see when you approach them more and more. It's a simple, small detail, but it actually plays a huge role in making me concerned about something that might appear on the other side, and also forces me to always keep in mind that I don't know what's lurking in this town. Another small aspect that I loved about the environment is how some stuff are scattered here and there to make players believe that there's a form of life around them, even though the town looks like a wasteland. A notable example is the plastic chair here, which indicated that someone used to sit there and enjoy some fresh air. And this is something I even do in my real life, and that's why I see it as very relatable to reality. Another thing is the pieces of clothing and the fabric hanging over the fence, which clearly belong to someone who used to live here. If we go back a little bit, we'll also notice how the falling leaves are incredible and well designed to make the atmosphere look genuine, but I was personally more impressed when I saw how the ground is vibrant almost all the time. The leaves and dirt are moving randomly as a result of the air, and this is really important for me to make me believe that this town is not just a bunch of buildings standing for the sake of forming a landscape. On top of the visual side, I also need to praise the sound effects here, because if you listen deeply, you'll hear a combination of sounds that form a terrifying audio that keeps hitting your ear as you explore the area. You can hear the wind and its power, but you can also hear random sounds like a metal object moving or falling somewhere, which is seriously compelling. Anyway, after we satisfy our eyes with the beautiful visuals outside, we start to witness some interesting events. There's a creature making noise, but he escapes once you see a glimpse of it. You run after it to see what's happening, but you find absolutely nothing, as it mysteriously vanished. This is the type of psychological horror that I love to see across the game. It's these moments that keep you excited all the time. After a little bit of investigation, we see a hole that seems to lead to a house. Once James goes inside it, the scene shifts to a different area inside the house. And I believe the goal of showing this hole here is to give you an idea that such details might be common across the game. As James explores the house, we can see that the place is designed perfectly on the inside. And this is not surprising for me, because if there's something that Bloober is very good at, it's definitely designing incredible, detailed, and scary buildings.
But I'm back.
If you played their games like Layers of Fear, Blair Witch, or Observer, you know that their main goal is always to scare you with the environment itself, because there's no combat. Bloober's cup of tea was always psychological horror, and that's why they learned to create heavily creepy environments to impress you, because they have no action or combat to tease you with. However, Silent Hill 2 is their first step into the field of actual survival horror. And now they're required to be good at combining some combat with the psychological part. And speaking of combat, after James finds a weird radio receiver in the house, we finally see our first enemy in this new gameplay footage. For those of you who are not familiar with the game, this enemy is called Lying Figure, and it's a disturbing monster with no hands but very aggressive. Here we can see James take a wooden stick from the window to use it as a weapon, which indicates that we will have a good amount of freedom in finding melee weapons in the remake. This enemy's main weapon is spit from his mouth, and it can be very harmful to you. James can push him away before hitting him as much as he can and dodging his spit. If we analyze the melee combat a little bit, I honestly see a notable improvement compared to the last trailer we saw. One of these improvements is the pace and weight of the stick when hitting the enemy. In a previous video, I said that the stick felt so light and that the movement was too weirdly fast, as if you're hitting a bag with an invisible stick. But in the new gameplay, we noticed that the movement is relatively slower. And you can see that the interaction between the weapon and the enemy creates a much more realistic dynamic. After this scene, James goes outside again, but he's injured, and he obviously needs some first aid. In a cool moment, he breaks the glass of the car to get some nutrition supplements to restore his health, and get back in shape. The strange part here is that we didn't see any icons or signs that could help us realize that there's something we need inside the car. I don't know if this is just in this video, but I honestly want it to be the same way in the actual game. Keeping us curious to search the area for supplements is always something I enjoy in survival horror, and that's why I would love it if things could be scattered here and there for you to find. Speaking of scattered things, the chilling body on the ground here is absolutely chilling and adds to the atmosphere, and I really loved how it's designed and was integrated with the wet street like a charm. Another cool thing is how James can now write down stuff on paper after he finds new things, which is a tiny new feature on the side. Anyway, afterwards, the video shifts to another scene where we can finally see one of the most memorable characters of the game, the one and only Laura. I don't want to spoil the story for you by telling you who Laura actually is and why she's here, but she's generally a young girl who wanders around the Silent Hill town, and she's also looking for Mary, just like James.
None of your business. You didn't love Mary anyway.
What? Hey, wait!
Here, we can see James's face clearly, and we can confirm that they did really add some tweaks to it after the last two trailers. Let's be honest, the face here looks very good, and the hair is also extremely realistic. I know some people might disagree, but I'm personally not a player who cares a lot about faces. The next part of the video takes us to one of the most iconic settings in Silent Hill 2, and may even be in the series in general. We get to see Brookhaven Hospital with realistic visuals we've never seen before, but we also get to see the second most important character in the game, Maria. As I said before, if there's one thing I know Bloober can't miss, it's definitely designing incredibly spooky buildings. I was expecting the hospital to look on point, but to be honest, it was even better than I expected. The scratches on the wall in particular were really something that got me in the mood for some reason, probably because I see them a lot on old buildings in real life. And when you walk in the hallway, it gives me the indie psychological horror vibes I feel in games that were inspired by PT. The reason I say this is because hallways in horror games should always be sources of stress and anticipation, because you don't know what's on the other side. And I really feel this here.
This place feels so empty. More than the other places we've been.
As we continue to explore the hospital, we see more of its eerie visuals, including a creepy photo of nurses on the wall. It's obvious that they spent a good amount of time designing this place, because I really loved watching this part over and over, focusing on the details. The sunlight from the windows, the broken glass on the floor, and the devastated doors all immerse me in the hospital and make me excited to investigate it. After this cool examination, we find Laura again.
Laura! Wait!
It's okay. We don't want to hurt you.
Now we're officially on the second floor of Brookhaven, which is known to be more terrifying than the first one. Here, we don't see any sunlight or any sight of the outside world, but we can hear a menacing sound getting closer. James prepares his gun, and we suddenly see a terrifying nurse passing by, but she is obviously unaware of his presence. So he avoids the trouble of confronting her by sneaking around behind her, which is the type of psychological horror and stealth we need. However, if we focus on the music during this part, we hear a familiar, disturbing sound that we recognize from the original. This music gives you a sign that a threat is nearby, and you need to either get the heck out or prepare your weapons.
Now, where is that girl?
Next, we got another hallway, and this one looks genuinely terrifying to walk in. We will meet a second nurse, but this time escaping is not an option and we need to fight. During this encounter, I was really impressed by this battle. Not because of James, but specifically because of the nurse herself. Aside from the fact that she puts up a good fight, she does something that really made me open my eyes to see it again. As James hits her with the pipe, she literally blocks it by holding it with her hand. This means that nurses here might actually be more badass than before, and will probably have a harder time dealing with them. We continue exploring the beautifully eerie hospital until we find a teddy bear. And I'm not going to talk about the backstory behind this stuff to avoid spoiling the game for you, but I appreciate the detail of showing James holding things in his hands and doing the full action. Afterwards, we get to pick up another weapon, and this time it's a big one, because the shotgun is made to get the job done with one shot in most cases. James continues to explore the hospital until we reach another section that caught my eye with how it's masterfully designed to portray how scary the place is with the creepy bugs moving on the walls. The last enemy we face in this video is probably the most disturbing one because he's a pain in the butt to deal with. It's another lying figure, but this time he's using a second strategy, which is attacking you from the ground while he's crawling like a freaking snake that you can't catch. Anyway, the rest of the gameplay is mostly about a small encounter between James and Laura, so I think it's time now to talk a little bit about some of the downsides, or at least the stuff that I wish were better. The first three things are the animations, and the animations. I say it multiple times because animations are basically losing their way on multiple occasions here, whether in combat or movements. The first animation that I felt was way too weird was the running animation. Even though it's less than 3 seconds here, we can clearly see that it's funky and not even compatible with the compelling walking style. The walking animation was very close to the reveal trailer, which I'm very satisfied with. But the running animation is simply something I would expect to see in a third-person indie game. In my opinion, if Bloober wants to find an example of what running animation should look like in such games, Resident Evil is the best example. Even though I hate the comparison, when I see how Leon runs in the Resident Evil 4 remake compared to James here in the remake, I feel like they're generations apart. So I would really love it if Bloober made some tweaks to improve how James runs in order to not ruin the dynamic of his presence in the game. On the other side, the way he runs while holding the gun is actually satisfying enough for me, and I feel it's much more realistic than when he runs empty-handed. Another disappointing animation occurs during combat. And even though combat in general is acceptable, I'm really not a fan of how James hits the enemies when they're on the ground. First of all, there's no variety in how multiple strikes can look, and it also really feels like James is not using enough power to match his vocal struggle. The animation doesn't make you excited to feel the weight of the stick while finishing off the enemy, because you always know that it will be generic and too funky like this. So I really hope they'll take care of that side more before the final release. The second downside, which is not really a huge downside for me, but it's actually an aspect that became so controversial more than anything else, which is the faces. The most infamous example is Angela, which was seen in an isolated trailer. If I'm being honest, I don't really care if Angela looks different or if they change her design completely, but what I do have a minor problem with is that she looks one generation behind James. When I see James's face and then see hers, I feel like I'm seeing two different games that were made years apart. If you even focus on the hair, you'll see James's hair looking insanely realistic, while hers looks PS3 level. In my opinion, the developers spent much more time working on James than anyone else, and this led to instability in quality across the board. This is not new in gaming because Alone in the Dark earlier this year basically made the same mistake. They spent most of the time making the main characters look exceptional, to the extent that the rest didn't get the same love. However, the bizarre thing that I noticed is that the faces are not identical across the scenes we watched. For example, Angela here looks completely different than when we see her here. She looks much better from this angle and is much more realistic. We can also see the same thing with Laura. Her face from this angle looks different than when we see her here. In general, I actually believe she's well designed in most cases, and as a young girl, she portrays the vibes and expressions that you would expect from such a reckless kid. But the way her face shape seems inconsistent in every scene is something that I couldn't ignore.
What is it?
A letter. For Mary.
What?
When it comes to voices, I believe everyone from Maria to Laura and even Angela is on point. Some people had a problem with how Angela sounded, but I personally can hear that voice without feeling weird. It's a unique voice and it has a tone that makes me like it.
No, you shouldn't be here.
On the other hand, James's voice is actually the tricky one because the guy literally sounds like an absolute badass, which is far away from what he was in the original. When you hear his voice in the remake during gameplay, there's no way you don't imagine a tough guy who knows what he's doing like Leon S. Kennedy.
I don't know. Let's look around. Where are you, Mary?
Meanwhile, in the original game, he basically sounded like a young, innocent man with a very peaceful and soft voice. And by the way, James in the game is a 29-year-old average dude, so it's very normal for him to sound fragile.
That's why I did it, honey. I just couldn't watch you suffer.
Personally, I don't see this as a deal breaker, and I really love James's voice in the remake. But for those who want everything to be faithful to the original, it might annoy them a little bit. Anyway, after discussing all of this, the real question now is, does Silent Hill 2 Remake have a chance to succeed? Well, to be honest, it does, but only if the developers continue to fix the mistakes in the next few months. To be honest, I'm impressed by Bloober. They seem to be pushing their limits and minimizing the flaws as much as they can, and it feels like this gameplay is a big step forward compared to the previous one. For those of you who watched my first video on the last trailer, you obviously know that I destroyed it with criticism left and right because I really was disappointed. Even visually, there's no way you can convince me that this new footage is not visually better than the previous one. So if we want to summarize the upsides here, we have to say the visuals and the environment are definitely at the top of the list. The atmosphere was also, for me, on point, and it showcases the vibe of psychological horror games. The sound effects are another upside that were even better than I expected, because even the footsteps here sound better than I could ever wish for. If you focus in the hospital, you'll even notice how James and Maria have different tones of footsteps, which really escalates the realism.
Where did she go?
I don't know. Let's look around.
The voice acting is 9 out of 10 across the board, and as I said, James's voice sounds very likable and interesting to hear. The downsides, I believe they're clear for everyone. The most common is the animation, because it really takes away from all the other amazing aspects. Hitting the enemies while they're on the ground needs serious improvement, and I think the developers will actually do something about it, because they'll see how people complain about it everywhere. The second downside, which is the face designs, is debatable and differs from one person to another. As I said earlier, my problem is not that the faces look different than the original, but that they don't look consistent in quality. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to see that Angela's face in this part doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's also not identical to the second part, but I have a feeling that we will see some tweaks in the final game. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier that one of the reasons behind this inconsistency is because these clips we're watching might be from different builds of the game. In other words, this part might be from an early version of the design, while this one is a more recent one, and they've been combined in the trailer because Bloober didn't finish all the scenes with the final design. However, as I said before, face designs are not something that decides whether I buy a game or not. So, in my opinion, the biggest obstacle for me is the melee combat animations, and I really wish they'd get better before October. Anyway, this is all for today, and this is my honest analysis of the new trailer and gameplay we watched. To be honest, the way the town looks was one of the main reasons that made me talk positively today, because I seriously would love to play in this setting in at least 10 more games besides this one. I love cloudy atmospheres even in real life, and when I always think of horror, I always think of weather and the environment like this in my mind. In fact, I actually believe the best time to play the game is on rainy nights, when you can hear the rain outside while you're diving into Silent Hill Town.
Mary, could you really be in this town?
Tell me in the comments what you think about the last gameplay and whether you felt any improvement or not. I also want to know if there's any downsides that you saw that I might have missed. I'm interested in your honest opinions, and I'm aware that most people will not agree on everything in the remake.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill.